In this video, we will be discussing quadrilaterals, and the first quadrilateral we're going to talk about is a parallelogram. And with a parallelogram, the opposite sides and the opposite angles are congruent. So in this shape, the left and the right are congruent, and the top and the bottom are congruent. And the angles diagonal from each other are also congruent. Opposite sides are parallel, so the top and the bottom will run on forever if we were to extend the lines, and they would never intersect each other. Same thing with the left and the right side. And the way that you show that lines are parallel is with little arrows. So these two are parallel, and these two are parallel. So you draw little pointed arrows on the ends. And then the diagonals bisect each other. So what that means is when I draw a diagonal through this shape from corner to corner, and I draw one from the other corner, they're going to intersect right here in the middle. So the diagonals I draw through the corners are going to intersect in the middle of the shape. The next shape is called a rhombus. And a rhombus has all congruent sides and opposite angles that are congruent, so the angles that are diagonal from each other are congruent. Opposite sides are parallel, so the left is parallel with the right and the top is parallel with the bottom. And diagonals are perpendicular bisectors. So I'm actually going to do this in a different color. So we're going to draw the diagonals this time, and I'm going to draw them as full lines this time. And I can draw them in up here too. When we draw these diagonals, perpendicular is when they make like that perfect T to make a 90-degree angle. So when I draw bisectors in a rhombus, because the sides are all the same size, I actually get perpendicular bisectors here in the middle of the shape. So all these angles in here are a right angle in the center of the shape with the diagonals. Now our next shape is a rectangle, and a rectangle and a parallelogram are very similar in their properties. Both a rectangle and a parallelogram have two pairs of congruent sides. They have two pairs of parallel sides, and they have diagonals that are congruent. So in a parallelogram, because the two corners are kind of stretched out, like you took both corners and you grabbed them and you pinched and then you pulled, they're not going to be congruent diagonals. Whereas with a rectangle, if I draw in the diagonals with a different color, you can see that they're going to be exactly the same size. Now, they're not perpendicular like they are in a rhombus, because a rhombus has all equal sides and it makes them perpendicular. There's still a little bit of a distance to go, so that makes more of an obtuse angle on the top and the bottom and an acute angle from the left and the right for the bisectors. But the diagonals are congruent. Those bisectors are congruent. And the other special thing is all angles have right angles in a rectangle, whereas in a parallelogram, they don't have the right angles. Our next shape is the square, and a square has very similar properties to a rhombus. So it has all congruent sides. It has two pairs of parallel sides, so the left and the right is parallel to the top, and the top and the bottom are parallel. Same thing with the rectangle, the left and the right, and then the top is parallel to the bottom. And in a square, the diagonals are congruent because there's perfect right angles. So if I draw in the diagonals, they're congruent in size to each other, but because the sides of a square are all the same size, it's going to have perpendicular, where they make that perfect T with a 90-degree angle. They have perpendicular bisectors. Our last two shapes, the first one is called a kite, and the most important property is they have adjacent sides that are congruent, and adjacent means they're next to each other. So these two sides are congruent and these two sides are congruent. And they also have one pair of angles that are congruent on either side. And the last shape is the trapezoid. And this one right here is actually called an isosceles trapezoid. So in an isosceles trapezoid, that's this one. It's like an isosceles triangle with the top cut off. So there's one pair of parallel sides in a trapezoid. So it's the top and the bottom piece, or in this case, it's the left and the right piece. And the base, so the bases are parallel to each other. And these are properties that you're going to need to memorize. This is not something that you can just learn overnight. You need to review your properties over and over and over again. So if we look at the next page, we have perpendicular as a vocabulary word. And perpendicular means that we have two lines that meet to form right angles. And those are 90-degree angles. So you can see the example of perpendicular there. And a bisector is an imaginary line that divides a shape in half from the corners. And there's your example of what a bisector looks like. So if we look down at the bottom, these are some quadrilateral properties questions. The first one says, which of the following has two pairs of parallel sides? Well, a triangle doesn't have any parallel sides. A trapezoid only has one pair of parallel sides, so it needs to be a parallelogram, which is C. And then I want to look at number 3. Look at the group of quadrilaterals. Which characteristic do all the quadrilaterals have in common? Do they all have 4 right angles? No. This one and this one do not. Opposite sides are congruent to each other. Well, all of them work except for the trapezoid. The top and the bottom aren't the same, so that doesn't work. And what is true is they have at least one pair of parallel sides. In the trapezoid, the top and the bottom, same thing on all the other shapes. There's one pair that are congruent. You need to do number 2 and number 4 on your own. So for number 2, it should be a square because it has 4 congruent sides and 4 right angles. And for number 4, it should be A, which 2 figures have 4 congruent sides. That would be a rhombus and a square. So let's talk about this chart. This is what we call the always, sometimes, never chart, and you're going to need to memorize how to fill out this chart. So quadrilateral is what we're learning about. We're learning about all the different kinds of quadrilaterals, but this is going to demonstrate the relationships between all of the quadrilaterals. So you can either memorize it alphabetically, so Q, and then we go to get to this little square, you have P, R, and S. Those go alphabetical order down the alphabet. Now what we can think of is a parallelogram, a rectangle are very similar to each other, and a rhombus and a square are also very similar to each other. So the other way you can remember to put these in over here in this little square that we have, and kite and trapezoid over on its own little way, is trapezoid doesn't really fit with anybody else. Kite doesn't really fit with anybody else, which is why they're out in no man's land. And then we know that all of these 4 are kind of interrelated to each other. The way that I remember it is with a little TV show that you've already probably watched, SpongeBob SquarePants, who lives in a pineapple under the sea, SpongeBob SquarePants, and he has a friend, his name is Patrick Star, who's on the beach, and the beach is at the top where the ocean meets the sand. And then, in order for SpongeBob to get to Patrick, he has to pass through the rocks, the rectangle and the rhombus. It doesn't matter which place rectangle and rhombus go, they can go on the left or the right. As long as they're in the middle between square and parallelogram, that's all that's important. And once you've gotten the chart drawn, the rule is always up, sometimes down, never side to side. Think of your parents waving their finger at you. Never, 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 you're allowed to do that. So let's go through these using our chart. A square is a rhombus. So a square to rhombus is going up. So square to rhombus, the direction for up, always up. So a square is always going to fit the characteristics for a rhombus. A kite is a trapezoid. Well, a kite to trapezoid would have to go side to side, and that can never happen. So a kite is never a trapezoid. Number 3, a parallelogram is a rectangle. Well, to go from parallelogram down to rectangle, always up, sometimes down. So this is sometimes. All right, I want you to do those 3. So a rectangle is sometimes a square. Quadrilateral is never a trapezoid. I'm sorry, is sometimes a trapezoid. Not never. Because quadrilateral goes down to trapezoid. And a kite is always a quadrilateral. All right, so I want you to try these 6 on your own. Use your notes to help you, use the chart to help you, and when you're ready, unpause the video and I'll give you the answers. There might be more than one answer for a few of them. And here are your answers for those 6 questions.